Hi, and thank you for coming to my presentation today on the governance of cooperatives. Before I start, I'd like to thank the Ferdine family for their support. The funds provided through the Hartley and Margaret Ferdine Scholarship have been invaluable for my research. I would also like to thank Professor Murray Fulton and the Center for the Study of Cooperatives for the opportunity to speak with you today. As you can gather, I'm not in Saskatoon. I was hoping to have a nice wintry backdrop behind me, but it's dark out and the snow's all melted here. Our backyard also looks like a post-apocalyptic wasteland, so you'll have to be content with my lovely beige blinds. The purpose of this talk is to highlight the research I've been doing as part of my PhD thesis. The structure of my talk is as follows: a discussion of contingency theory on the issues of one-size-fits-all governance, an introduction to the cooperative business study, an examination of some of the study's data, and lastly, concluding remarks. Whether because of legislation or best practices, cooperatives are increasingly adopting governance practices originally intended for investor-owned firms. The problem is that these practices may be unsuitable for member-owned organizations. Much of the legislation and best practices treat all organizations as if they were the same. Governance systems become one-size-fits-all. However, if organizations differ in meaningful ways, then governance mechanisms designed for one organizational form will not necessarily fit another. Misfitting mechanisms may do more harm than good, decreasing board effectiveness and hampering firm performance. Effective governance recognizes the influence of context. For instance, the majority of corporate governance research states that firm performance suffers as boards exceed 10 directors. However, more complicated firms need more advice, and boards may have to exceed the optimum size to possess sufficient expertise to guide management. Independent directors have also been shown to be more effective when it's easier to gather information about the firms they oversee. If information costs are high, then independent directors may be disadvantaged because it's difficult for them to acquire the organization-specific knowledge needed to properly guide management. Inside directors, who are both board members and employees of the firm, already have an in-depth understanding of the company and don't have to pay the cost of trying to ramp up their knowledge. Alongside firm complexity or information costs, other contextual factors associated with particular governance mechanisms include the social connectedness of directors, a firm's prestige, its size or age, and a CEO's power. Organizational type can also play a role. For instance, whether a firm is family-owned and run can influence whether management is perceived as self-serving or altruistic. All of this points towards the necessity of contingency theory as an underpinning for corporate governance. According to contingency theory, organizations perform best when what they do fits their particular situation. By extension, a firm's governance system will perform better if it matches the firm's characteristics and environment. Traditional governance theories such as agency theory or stewardship theory don't say much about how contexts affect a particular governance mechanism. Yet failing to account for differences between organizations may lead to inappropriate governance mechanisms being used and firm performance suffering. Most organizations choose their corporate governance structures because of a specific issue. As Adams, Hermelin, and Weisbach describe it, we need to give at least some weight to the possibility that a governance mechanism represents the right solution to an organization's problem. Simply because a mechanism doesn't align with best practices doesn't make it wrong. However, ignoring governance research or best practices won't make a mechanism right either. Instead, theory, research, and best practices need to be considered together with contexts when developing governance structures. What this means for cooperatives is that simply adopting something originally created for investor-owned firms may not produce the desired outcomes. If contexts differ, that is, if co-ops are different than IOFs, then the governance mechanisms designed for investor-owned firms may not fit firms that are member-owned. Data allowing for a meaningful and statistically valid comparison between cooperatives and IOFs are not available, however. Instead, what I've done is look at the differences between consumer and producer co-ops. The logic is simple. If the two types differ in terms of their characteristics and practices, then any one-size-fits-all governance mechanism may be inappropriate regardless of whether it's intended for IOFs or cooperatives. Alongside examining the differences between consumer and producer co-ops in the next section, I'm also going to discuss some of the associated research. The purpose here is not to describe a best way, but instead to describe what's going on and whether co-op governance agrees with or contravenes what the research indicates. If context matters, and I think it does, then individual co-ops need to critically look at their governance practices and determine whether they help or hinder organizational sustainability. The Cooperative Business Study, or I'll refer to it as CBS for short, serves as the basis for my research. The CBS was collected by researchers from the University of Wisconsin's Center for Cooperatives, and is unique in that it provides insight into board behaviors. Most governance research draws connections between board composition and firm performance, such as the relationship between the percentage of independent directors on a board and a firm's market value, without examining what directors actually do. If board behavior is looked at, the variables of interest are usually proxies. For instance, CEO tenure has been used as a proxy for CEO influence. Longer-serving chief executives are theorized to exert greater influence and therefore play a greater role in selecting board members. The CBS, on the other hand, explicitly asks CEOs and board chairs the degree to which the chief executive influences selection. In terms of its methodology and representativeness, the CBS is based on interviews with CEOs and board chairs from 485 co-ops in the United States. The co-ops were selected through stratified random sampling. This means the CBS should provide an accurate representation of co-ops in the US. Although this may not exactly mirror the distribution of co-ops in Canada, the governance characteristics should be similar. Turning to the data, we see that of the 485 co-ops in the study, 46% of them were from the agriculture sector. Grocery cooperatives made up the next largest sector at 13%, followed by rural electric cooperatives, farm credit cooperatives, and credit unions. At the other end of the scale, water waste co-ops accounted for less than 1% of the sample, and media cooperatives less than a quarter. All the agriculture co-ops and all the arts and crafts co-ops were producer co-ops. All of the RECs and water waste co-ops were consumer co-ops. The other sectors were a mix of both. Overall, 43.5% of the sample were consumer co-ops, and the remaining 56.5% producer. The CBS contains a lot of data, from specifics about CEOs, such as their age and education, to how affected board chairs would be if their co-ops no longer existed. The two things I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk are board composition and board behavior. The reason for this is that they drive most of the discussion on corporate governance. On average, the cooperative board surveys had 9 directors, which is the same mean size as Canadian cooperatives and American and Canadian IOFs. A 9-person board is in line with optimum board size, which, as mentioned, is anywhere between 7 to 10 directors. The common sentiment is that smaller boards are more cohesive and productive because of improved group dynamics. Larger boards experience problems of social loafing, free riding, and higher coordination costs. However, the relationship between board size and firm performance may be more nuanced than smaller boards are better. As mentioned, research suggests that complex firms perform better if they have larger boards. This is because senior managers of complex firms require more advice, which larger boards are more likely to provide. Although the CBS doesn't show any clear association between board size and firm complexity, it is worth noting that 4 of the 5 largest boards are for large-scale second-tier purchasing co-ops. The 5th largest board is a producer cooperative with operations throughout the United States, Mexico, and South America. Each of these organizations would be considered complex by Coles, Daniel, and Levine. The issue of gender diversity is gaining increased prominence in corporate governance research and policy. Evidence suggests that female directors positively impact board and firm performance. Greater diversity on the board is associated with more effective problem solving, increased creativity and innovation, and better corporate leadership. Female directors also tend to use cooperation, collaboration, and consensus building more frequently and more effectively than male directors. Opinions differ about how many women are needed on a board to positively impact performance. Some suggest that at least 3 female directors are needed, while others say only 1. If it is 3, then both consumer and producer co-ops fall short. Consumer co-ops had, on average, 2.36 female directors, with a median of 2. Producer co-ops fared worse, having an average of 0.74 female directors with a median of 0. Part of the reason that producer co-ops have fewer female directors may be that they have smaller candidate pools to draw potential directors from. The median number of members for producer co-ops in the CBS was 585. For consumer co-ops, it was significantly larger at 3,720. Demographics may also play a role. The agricultural sector accounted for 86% of producer co-ops in the CBS. According to the USDA, 86% of farmers are male, which means that some ag co-ops have a very small number of females in their membership. Smaller candidate pools with fewer female members may mean fewer female directors overall. Understanding why producer boards lack female directors is important. Boards have 2 roles: to control management and to guide management. Increased board diversity, especially having that critical mass of at least 3 female directors, has been associated with increased involvement in strategic planning. In other words, a more diverse board may be able to offer management better advice. Overall, producer boards appear to be less involved in strategic and budgetary planning. Part of this difference may be due to varying levels of diversification. Producer co-ops tend to be more diversified in the services offered to members or the companies that they own. Diversification has been shown to have a negative association with board participation and planning. As firms become more diversified, their boards become less involved. Low levels of involvement may also indicate that directors are unfamiliar with the co-ops they oversee, or that a board lacks a wide range of skills and expertise. Determining whether diminished involvement is due to a cooperative structure, such as its level of diversification, or deficiencies on its board is important. To effectively guide and challenge management, directors need to understand what their co-ops do. This requires sufficient skills and expertise. Corporate governance best practices, legislation, and empirical research all point to the importance of directors having the right expertise. They need to be able to understand what's going on to properly guide management. As co-ops have become larger and more complex, they're increasingly seeking directors with particular skill sets. The problem with choosing directors based on their expertise and experience is that this may exclude some members from running for the board. Endorsing or recruiting specific candidates can lead to democratic member control being ignored and members feeling that their interests are not being represented. You may be familiar with the issues experienced by MEC here in Canada or the Cooperative Group in the UK. Both were criticized for tightening restrictions on who could run for the board and for rejecting candidates who lacked financial acumen or expertise running similar companies. For the Cooperative Group, the process was so contentious that members threatened to halt board elections through legal injunction. One way of avoiding privileging certain candidates over others, but still addressing board deficiencies, is to seek external advice. I've talked about this with the board chair of one of Canada's largest co-ops. He's of the opinion that you get what you get in terms of board members. You don't actually discriminate based on skill set, and any deficiencies the board has are made up using external experts. Looking at the CBS, we see that most co-ops engage external advisors. However, there is a difference between consumer and producer co-ops. Whereas 78% of consumer co-ops made use of outside experts, only 67% of producer co-ops do the same. If directors don't have the skills needed to properly advise management and external advisors aren't being engaged, board involvement in strategy and budgeting may suffer. Interestingly, producer co-ops held fewer board meetings per year, 10 1/3 on average compared to consumer co-ops, which had 12. Although average meeting lengths were similar, about 3.5 hours for each co-op type, what really differed was who set the agenda. For 75% of producer co-ops, meeting agendas were set by the CEO alone or the CEO with board approval. Only 10% indicated their board chair was the primary agenda setter. For consumer co-ops, CEO influence was much less. The CEO solely set the agenda for only 23% of consumer co-ops, and for 21%, the board chair was solely responsible for agenda setting. According to Jensen, one result of CEOs setting agendas is that very little information actually reaches directors. As he puts it, this limitation severely restricts the ability of even highly talented board members to contribute effectively to the monitoring and evaluation of the CEO and company strategy. In other words, part of the reason producer co-op boards may be less involved in planning is that their CEOs are more likely to determine what's dealt with at board meetings. Another reason for their board's decreased involvement in planning may be because producer co-op CEOs were more involved in the director selection process. Almost 20% of producer co-op CEOs indicated they played an active role in selecting and screening board candidates. For consumer co-ops, that percentage was closer to 10. The ability to resist CEO influence is fundamental to board success. Directors who are co-opted or unjustifiably swayed by management cannot effectively represent members. If CEOs can influence director selection, they can populate boards with people who are overly sympathetic to management. Boards filled with pro-management cheerleaders have been shown to diminish firm performance. Directors who allegiance to the CEO because she was influential in their appointment give the chief executive greater latitude, more managerial discretion, and higher compensation. They are more likely to be yes men, agreeing with CEOs out of hand instead of actively challenging or guiding them. So what does all of this mean for co-ops? For starters, it shows that there are differences between consumer and producer co-ops. In this short examination of the CBS, we saw that consumer boards were more diverse, more involved in strategic and budgetary planning, and look for external advice more often. Given these differences, it may be prudent to consider situational and organizational differences before simply applying IOF governance measures to cooperatives. Consider, for instance, the legislated push for board gender equality that's happening in Europe. Countries such as Norway and Belgium now require corporate boards to be at least 1/3 female. If a similar mandate was enacted here, it could be problematic for producer co-ops. Almost 3/4 of the producer co-ops surveyed had no female directors, meaning the majority couldn't even meet a requirement of 1 female on the board, let alone 3. Mandating a minimum number of female directors could place undue emphasis on recruiting or endorsing female candidates. It could also mean that a board seat sits vacant if there is no one to fill it. For instance, Article 518 of the Belgian Companies Code requires that boards of state-owned or publicly traded companies be at least 1/3 female. Failure to comply results in the nullification of board nominations that don't bring the number of female directors to 33%. The question for co-ops becomes whether any benefit from having more female directors is lost if other aspects of governance suffer. Reducing its size until it meets a gender quota could compromise a board's ability to advise management or make its already serving directors overwhelmed and ineffective. This isn't to say that producer co-ops shouldn't diversify their boards. I'm only using gender quotas as an example because I have the data and because there are real-world policies I can refer to. Co-op boards, regardless of type, should diversify. Homogeneous boards are more likely to leave management unchecked. And if managers can do whatever they want, then there's a greater chance they'll serve their own interests and not the interests of members. What I'm trying to say is that context matters. Governance systems need to match the particulars of the organizations they pertain to. Ill-fitting mechanisms may unintentionally cause more harm than good. As co-ops continue to gain prominence, they'll have to show they're well governed. Simply adopting IOF governance mechanisms may appear to be good governance, but it might not be enough to ensure organizational sustainability. Instead, co-ops need to ensure their governance practices are based on sound research and address their particular problems and situations. Thank you for your time.